Story 1: The Haunting Within. In the quiet, unassuming town of Millbrook, nestled amidst the rolling hills of the countryside, there stood a house that had long been abandoned by the living. Its windows were shattered, its wooden facade weathered and worn. Locals whispered tales of its dark history, of a family that had once lived within its walls, only to meet a tragic and mysterious end. They spoke of whispers in the night, of eerie shadows dancing behind the curtains, and of a malevolent presence that seemed to linger within the very foundations of the house. Few dared to venture near, for fear of the unsettling aura that surrounded the place. But for Emily, a young and curious journalist seeking to make her mark, the allure of a haunting story was too great to resist. Armed with her notepad and camera, she made her way to the decrepit house one fateful autumn afternoon, the leaves rustling ominously beneath her feet. As she stepped through the creaking doorway, Emily was immediately struck by the suffocating sense of dread that seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. The interior of the house was in a state of disarray, furniture overturned and cobwebs clinging to every surface. She shivered, though whether from the chill in the air or the fear that gripped her heart, she could not say. Ignoring the voice in her mind that screamed at her to turn back, Emily pressed on, determined to uncover the truth behind the legends that surrounded the house. She made her way through the dimly lit corridors, her footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. It was then that she heard it, a faint, plaintive whisper that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. "Help me," it begged, the words barely audible yet filled with a desperate plea for salvation. Heart-pounding, Emily followed the sound, her pulse quickening with each step. It led her to a small, dusty room at the end of a long hallway. The air in the room was heavy, oppressive, and Emily could feel the weight of unseen eyes upon her as she crossed the threshold. There, in the center of the room, stood an old, weathered dollhouse. Its paint was chipped and faded, its windows dark and empty. Yet despite its decrepit appearance, there was something undeniably sinister about the miniature structure. Drawing closer, Emily noticed that the windows of the dollhouse were not empty after all. Tiny figures fashioned from scraps of cloth and string peered out at her with lifeless eyes. They seemed to be trapped within the confines of the miniature rooms, their expressions frozen in silent agony. A chill ran down Emily's spine as she realized that each figure bore a striking resemblance to the members of the family that had once lived in the house. There was the father, his face twisted in a rictus of terror. The mother, her eyes wide with madness. And the child, a look of unutterable sorrow etched upon its tiny features. As she reached out to touch the dollhouse, Emily felt a sudden surge of dizziness wash over her. The room seemed to spin, the walls closing in around her in a suffocating embrace. And then, without warning, the world went black. When Emily awoke, she found herself lying on the cold, dusty floor of the room. Her head throbbed with pain, and a feeling of unease settled in the pit of her stomach. As she struggled to her feet, Emily noticed that the dollhouse was no longer empty. The figures within had come to life, their tiny limbs moving with a grotesque semblance of motion. Horror gripped her heart as she watched in terror as the miniature family enacted a twisted parody of their final moments. The father figure stumbled and fell, his body convulsing in agony as unseen forces seemed to tear him apart from within. The mother figure shrieked in horror, her hands clawing at her own face as if trying to tear herself apart. And the child figure wept, its tiny shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Unable to tear her gaze away, Emily felt a growing sense of dread wash over her. She knew with a sickening certainty that the malevolent presence that haunted the house had somehow taken hold of her. Desperate to escape, Emily turned to flee, only to find the door blocked by an unseen force. Panic clawed at her throat as she realized that she was trapped, alone with the twisted specters of the dollhouse. Hours stretched into eternity as Emily cowered in the corner of the room, the haunted figures drawing closer with each passing moment. Their eyes, empty yet filled with a terrible hunger, seemed to bore into her very soul. And then, just as all hope seemed lost, Emily heard a voice. It was faint at first, a mere whisper on the wind, but it grew steadily stronger until it filled the room with its presence. "Emily," it murmured, the sound soft yet filled with an otherworldly power. "You must break the curse." Driven by a newfound sense of purpose, Emily looked around the room, her eyes settling on the dollhouse. With trembling hands, she reached out and grasped the miniature structure, feeling a surge of energy course through her veins. Closing her eyes, Emily focused all of her willpower on the dollhouse, willing the malevolent spirit within to leave this place forever. She could feel its resistance, a dark and malevolent force that threatened to overwhelm her, but Emily did not waver. With a final cry of defiance, she shattered the dollhouse against the floor, the sound of splintering wood echoing through the room like a thunderclap. For a moment all was silent, and then slowly the oppressive aura that had filled the room began to dissipate. The figures within the dollhouse crumbled to dust, their malevolent presence banished forever. Exhausted yet triumphant, Emily sank to her knees, the weight of her ordeal finally catching up with her. As she looked around the now empty room, she knew that she had done what few dared to even attempt. The house, once a place of unspeakable horror, was now silent. The malevolent spirit that had held it in its grip for so long was gone, its curse broken at last. And though Emily knew that the memory of her ordeal would haunt her for the rest of her days, she also knew that she had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. As she made her way out of the abandoned house, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon, Emily couldn't help but glance back at the shattered remains of the dollhouse, and in that moment she swore that she could hear the faintest whisper of gratitude on the wind. The town of Millbrook would never forget the journalist who had faced the horror within the haunted house and emerged alive, and Emily, for her part, would always carry with her the knowledge that some evils were best left undisturbed. For in the darkest corners of the world, where the veil between the living and the dead grows thin, there are things that lurk, waiting, watching, and sometimes they are not content to remain hidden. The end. Story 2. Echoes of the Forgotten. The old estate on the outskirts of town stood like a silent sentinel, its once grand facade now weathered and worn by time. Ivy crawled up the crumbling walls, and the windows stared out like empty eyes, devoid of life or warmth. It was said that the mansion held secrets darker than the shadows that clung to its halls, and stories whispered of a tragic history that had left the place cursed. Amelia, an ambitious young historian fascinated by the macabre, had always been drawn to the estate's eerie allure. Armed with her notebook and a determination to uncover the truth, she ventured into its decaying depths one moonlit night, the chill of autumn swirling around her. As she stepped through the threshold, a wave of coldness washed over her, sending shivers down her spine. The air was thick with dust and the faint scent of decay, and every creak and groan of the old mansion seemed to echo with a sinister resonance. Undeterred, Amelia pressed on, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of fallen leaves that carpeted the grand entrance hall. Moonlight filtered through the cracked windows, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls like specters. Her heart pounding, Amelia made her way deeper into the mansion, the darkness enveloping her like a suffocating embrace. It was then that she heard it, a faint, mournful whisper that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. "Help me," the voice pleaded, its words echoing through the empty halls. Amelia froze, her blood running cold. The voice was unmistakably human, yet it carried with it an otherworldly quality that sent chills down her spine. Summoning her courage, she followed the voice, her senses on high alert. It led her to a small, forgotten room, tucked away in a remote corner of the mansion. The door hung off its hinges, swinging back and forth with an eerie creaking sound. Heart-pounding, Amelia stepped inside, the air heavy with the weight of untold sorrow. The room was small and cluttered with dusty relics of the past, old furniture covered in tattered sheets, faded photographs and yellowed letters. But it was the painting that drew Amelia's gaze, its vibrant colors stark against the gloom of the room. It depicted a young woman with hauntingly familiar features, her eyes filled with a sadness that seemed to reach out from the canvas. As Amelia studied the painting, she felt a sudden chill run down her spine. It was as if the woman in the portrait was watching her, her gaze following Amelia's every move. And then, without warning, the painting began to change. The woman's eyes darkened, her expression twisting into one of agony. A low, guttural growl filled the room, and the temperature plummeted as an unseen force seemed to fill the air. Amelia stumbled back in horror, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew then that the mansion was not merely haunted, it was possessed. Desperate to escape, she turned to flee, only to find the door slammed shut before her eyes. Panic rising within her, Amelia pounded on the door, screaming for help, but her cries were drowned out by the unearthly howls that filled the room. And then, in the midst of the chaos, she heard the voice again, the same mournful whisper that had led her here. "Help me," it pleaded, the words filled with a desperate urgency. Driven by a sudden compulsion, Amelia turned back to the painting. The woman's eyes bore into her soul, and she could feel the weight of centuries of sorrow and anguish pressing down upon her. With trembling hands, she reached out to touch the painting, a surge of energy coursing through her veins. Images flashed before her eyes, scenes of unspeakable horror and suffering, of a life torn apart by tragedy and loss. And then, with a sudden clarity, she understood. The woman in the painting was not merely a victim of the mansion's curse. She was its source. Summoning all of her strength, Amelia closed her eyes and focused her mind, willing the malevolent spirit within the painting to release its hold on the mansion and the souls trapped within its walls. For a moment there was silence, and then with a deafening roar the room exploded into chaos. The walls shook, the furniture rattled, and the air crackled with energy as the spirit fought against Amelia's will. But she did not waver. With every ounce of her being, she poured her energy into the task, her determination unwavering. And then with a final ear-splitting shriek, the spirit was banished. The mansion fell silent once more, the oppressive aura that had filled the room dissipating like a fog. Exhausted and shaken, Amelia sank to her knees, the weight of her ordeal finally catching up with her. But she knew that she had done what she came here to do. As she made her way out of the mansion, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon, Amelia couldn't help but glance back at the painting one last time, and in that moment, she swore she saw a faint, grateful smile on the woman's face. For in the darkness of the old estate, where the echoes of the forgotten lingered, Amelia had found redemption. The end.